The cool morning air carried a faint staleness as I made my way to the garbage dump, my footsteps soft against the damp pavement. It was early, too early for anyone else to be out, but I had taken to these morning walks ever since retirement, enjoying the quiet solitude before the city stirred to life. As I neared the dumping ground, a rustling sound caught my attention. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but then I saw it. A small, hunched figure rummaging through the trash, hands clawing through the refuse with desperate urgency. My breath hitched. Mischievous kids? A stray animal? A homeless person? The sight was unsettling, but something inside me compelled me to step closer, curiosity warring with unease. And then I saw her. A tiny child, her face smeared with grime, her hair a tangled mess, clutching a piece of moldy bread in both hands and stuffing it into her mouth as if it were the last meal she'd ever have. The sheer hunger in her eyes, the single-minded focus as she devoured that rotten scrap, made my stomach turn. A wave of nausea and dread hit me all at once, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when she turned to look at me. My heart nearly stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that face. That child was my granddaughter, Blair. But that was impossible. Blair had died 2 years ago. For a moment, the world tilted on its axis. I felt unsteady, like I had been yanked from reality and tossed into some fever dream where logic and reason had abandoned me. But there was no mistaking those eyes, those delicate features, the way she held herself. This was Blair. My Blair. The child who had been swallowed by tragedy, lost to the cruel forces of nature, and mourned by an entire family. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend the impossible. "Blair?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But she heard me. She flinched. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted around as if expecting punishment, as if survival had become synonymous with fear. Her lips quivered, and for a moment, I feared she would bolt. But then, in a small, hesitant voice, she whispered back, "Grandma?" That single word shattered me. It broke through the haze of disbelief and sent a tidal wave of emotions crashing down: joy, horror, confusion, fury. How was she alive? Where had she been? Who had taken her? What had happened to my sweet, innocent granddaughter in these 2 years of silence? I dropped to my knees before her, my hands trembling as I reached out, afraid that if I touched her, she would vanish like a cruel mirage. But she was real, cold, filthy, thin, too thin. Her tiny frame was covered in bruises, old and new, and as my gaze swept over her, the horror deepened. This child had not just survived, she had suffered. My stomach churned as a new burning realization took root in my mind. Someone had done this to her. Someone had stolen her away, hidden her from us, and treated her like this, like trash, like something disposable. The rage that surged through me was unlike anything I had ever known. But I swallowed it down, forcing myself to focus on what mattered most in this moment. "Come home with me," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "You're safe now." Blair hesitated for only a second before nodding, her small hand slipping into mine. The moment her fingers curled around mine, I knew. I would burn the world down to get justice for her. Back home, I did everything I could to make her feel safe. A warm bath, fresh clothes, a real meal. Simple things. But I watched her with a breaking heart as she hesitated before eating, as if expecting the food to be taken away. She ate carefully, with a strange, quiet discipline, like someone who had learned that wasting even a crumb was unacceptable. And when she finally spoke, it was with a quietness that sent chills down my spine. "I remember your house," she murmured, her fingers trailing over the fabric of the borrowed pajamas I had given her. "It's warm here." The way she said it, like warmth was something foreign, something unfamiliar, made me want to weep. But I couldn't afford to lose myself in grief. Not yet. There were too many questions that needed answers, and as I carefully navigated our conversation, a terrifying truth began to unravel. Blair had not simply wandered off that day at the campsite. She had been taken, stolen, hidden away, and not by a stranger. No, the truth was far worse. It was someone we knew, someone who should have loved and protected her, someone who had, for reasons unfathomable, erased her existence from our lives and forced her to endure unimaginable cruelty. As she spoke, piece by piece, the picture became clearer, and with it, my horror grew. The reason she knew how to read, how to count, how to behave in a way far beyond her years. It wasn't because she had been nurtured, but because she had been trained, conditioned. She had been taught that her worth was tied to what she could provide, and she had believed it. I barely managed to keep my composure, my hands curling into fists beneath the table as she recounted her life over the past 2 years. I knew then that I couldn't handle this alone. This was bigger than me, bigger than anything I had ever faced. So I did the only thing I could. I called my son. At first, he didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Who would? A child who had been declared dead suddenly reappearing. It sounded insane. "Mom," he said, his voice groggy with sleep. "Are you sure you're not dreaming?" I heard the skepticism, the exhaustion, the sadness still lingering in his tone even after all this time. Blair's death had hollowed him out. He had accepted it, buried the pain as best as he could. But now, here I was, telling him that the daughter he had mourned for 2 years was alive and sitting in my kitchen. "I wouldn't joke about something like this," I said firmly. "Come to my house. Now." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a quiet, shaken exhale. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. When he arrived, the moment he saw Blair, all the air left his lungs. He staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and raw emotion. "Blair?" His voice cracked. And then she said it. The word that broke him. "Daddy." He crossed the room in seconds, falling to his knees and pulling her into his arms, his entire body trembling with suppressed sobs. I watched, my own throat tight, as father and daughter clung to each other, the past 2 years of grief and loss melting away in an instant. But the moment was short-lived, because now that Blair was back, now that we knew the truth, there was only one thing left to do: find the person responsible and make them pay. The moment of reunion was fleeting, a fragile bubble of warmth that popped as soon as reality came crashing back in. My son, still holding Blair as if he feared she would vanish again, turned to me, his eyes wide with a storm of emotions: hope, rage, fear. "Who did this?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight behind it was immense. He wasn't just asking, he was demanding, and I had no answer. Not yet. Blair, nestled against him, stiffened slightly, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt like a lifeline. The way she held onto him, as if bracing for something, sent a cold shiver through me. This child, this innocent, broken child, was afraid. Afraid of telling the truth. Afraid of what would happen if she spoke the wrong words. And that fear told me everything I needed to know. Whoever had taken her, whoever had kept her, had taught her that silence was survival. That secrets were the only thing keeping her safe, and that realization made my blood run cold. I crouched down beside them, my voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, you're home now. No one can hurt you anymore." Her big eyes flickered to me, uncertain, searching. For what? I wasn't sure. Permission? Reassurance? A sign that she could finally let go of the weight she had been carrying? She hesitated, her little fingers curling against my son's chest, before she whispered something so quiet, so soft, that I barely caught it. "I don't know if I'm allowed." My heart clenched painfully. Allowed, as if she had been conditioned to believe that even speaking the truth required permission. I exchanged a glance with my son, and I saw the barely contained fury in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack his teeth. He had always been a patient man, a rational one, but this was something else. This was his child. And someone had stolen her, tortured her, and left her believing she had no voice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You are allowed, sweetheart. You can tell us anything. No one will ever hurt you again." Another pause, another long moment of silence before she finally spoke. And when she did, my blood turned to ice. "Aunt Lisa said if I ever told, bad things would happen." The room went deathly silent. I felt my stomach drop, felt the breath leave my lungs as if I had been punched. Lisa, my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, the woman we had all trusted, the woman who had stood beside us as we mourned, who had comforted us, cried with us, placed flowers on Blair's empty grave, the woman who, for 2 years, had lived among us as if nothing had ever happened. My son's face went pale, his arms tightening protectively around Blair. His voice was hoarse, choked. "Lisa?" He said the name like he couldn't believe it, like his own mind refused to accept what he had just heard. But Blair nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line, her tiny shoulders tensing as if bracing for the storm she had just unleashed. It made no sense. Lisa had never shown any signs of cruelty. She had been a devoted mother to their other children, a supportive wife, a loving presence. But as I sat there, my mind racing, fragments of the past 2 years began piecing themselves together in ways I had never before considered. The way Lisa had been so insistent that we stop searching after a year, the way she had been the first to suggest holding a funeral, pushing for closure, the way she had spoken of moving on, of accepting fate, of not torturing ourselves with false hope. And then there were the little things, the way she always seemed to tense when Blair's name was mentioned, the way she avoided conversations about what could have happened, the way she had slowly, methodically, distanced herself from anything that had to do with Blair's disappearance. And now, suddenly, it all made sense. Lisa had never been grieving. She had been hiding something. And the something, no, the someone, had been right there all along. My son looked like a man on the verge of breaking apart. His hands trembled as he cupped Blair's face, as if needing to see her, to hear her, to know with absolute certainty that this nightmare was real. "Did she hurt you?" His voice was barely controlled, every syllable laced with an emotion too dangerous to name. Blair hesitated, then nodded. Just once. A small movement, but it was enough. It was enough to snap something inside my son. He stood so fast that the chair scraped violently against the floor, his entire body shaking with fury. "I'm going to kill her." I grabbed his arm before he could bolt out the door, my own heart pounding furiously. "We need to think," I hissed, forcing myself to stay calm even though my own hands were trembling. "If we go in blind, we'll lose her. We need proof." My son was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring, his hands clenching and unclenching like a man barely restraining himself from tearing the world apart with his bare hands. But he knew I was right. Lisa was cunning, manipulative. If we confronted her now, she would find a way to twist this, to escape, to erase the truth just as she had done before. We needed to be smart. We needed to gather evidence. And most importantly, we needed to make sure she never, ever had the chance to hurt Blair again. Blair, still curled on the couch, watched us with wide, wary eyes. She was too young to fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. She knew that the monster who had taken her had been someone she should have been able to trust, and now she was watching us, waiting to see if we would protect her or if we would fail her again. I knelt beside her, brushing a gentle hand over her hair. "Blair, sweetheart, I need you to help us, okay? Can you tell us everything? Anything you remember?" She hesitated again, then gave a tiny nod. "She used to lock me in a room," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was dark. No windows. I had to be really quiet, or she'd get mad." I swallowed hard, bile rising in my throat. "And did she take you somewhere? Did she make you go places?" Blair bit her lip. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. "Sometimes men came to see me." The air in the room turned suffocating. My vision blurred at the edges, rage and nausea mixing in a volatile, explosive cocktail. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My son staggered backward as if he had been physically struck, his hands gripping his hair, his entire body shaking with the force of his fury. We had assumed, God help us, we had assumed that Blair had simply been taken, that she had been lost. We had never imagined that she had been used. Lisa hadn't just stolen her, she had sold her. I took a shuddering breath, forcing myself to push past the horror, to push past the overwhelming urge to break something, to hurt someone. "We're going to stop her," I promised Blair, my voice steady despite the war raging inside me. "She'll never hurt you again." And as I met my son's eyes, I knew. Lisa had made one mistake. She had let Blair escape. And now we were coming for her. The air in the house felt thick with something suffocating. Rage, terror, the unbearable weight of a truth too horrifying to fully grasp. My son stood rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps as he fought against the primal instinct surging through his veins, to storm out of this house and rip Lisa apart with his bare hands. But I held firm, my grip on his arm unrelenting, my own body shaking with barely controlled fury. We couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. Not when we were so close to destroying her in a way she couldn't escape. Blair sat curled up on the couch, her tiny frame trembling, exhaustion warring with the fear still clinging to her like a shadow. She had said enough. More than enough. Enough to make me want to tear through the world, to burn everything Lisa had ever touched to the ground. But we needed more. Evidence. Something that would ensure Lisa never saw the light of day again. My son finally wrenched himself free, pacing the room like a caged animal, hands buried in his hair. "We go to the police," he said, voice hoarse, but there was a hesitance in his tone that made my stomach churn. We both knew what he was thinking. The system. It had failed before. How many times had we heard horror stories of children slipping through the cracks, of monsters walking free on technicalities? What if Lisa had covered her tracks too well? What if she had allies in places we couldn't see? The thought made me sick. No. I took a deep breath, forcing my own rage into something sharp, something calculated. "We go to the police, but not until we have everything we need. We do this right. We find proof. We make sure she can't wiggle her way out of this." Blair shifted, hesitant, then whispered, "I know where she keeps her phone." The words hit like a gunshot. I turned to her slowly. "Her phone?" She gave the smallest nod, glancing toward the doorway as if Lisa might appear at any moment. She had messages. Pictures. Her voice broke, her tiny hands clenching into fists. She used to say if I was bad, she'd show people. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thought of what might be on that phone, the depths of Lisa's depravity, sent a white-hot wave of nausea through me. But beneath the horror was something else, something dangerous. If that phone had evidence, if it contained even a fraction of what we suspected, it would be Lisa's undoing. My son and I exchanged a glance. He didn't need to say anything. I knew exactly what he was thinking. We had to get that phone. The house was dark when we arrived, the windows gaping black like the eyes of a corpse. My son was tense beside me, barely contained fury rolling off him in waves as we crept toward the back door. Lisa was inside, likely asleep, unaware that the walls she had so carefully built were about to crumble. My hands were steady as I picked the lock, an old skill, one I hadn't used in decades. But tonight, it felt like second nature. The door clicked open with a quiet sigh, and we slipped inside, ghosts in the place she had turned into a house of horrors. Everything was too neat, too perfect. The kind of home that masked the rot beneath. My son hesitated only briefly before heading toward their bedroom. Lisa's phone, if Blair was right, would be there. I followed close behind, heart hammering. Each second felt stretched too thin, the silence pressing down on us as we eased the door open. Lisa was there, asleep, oblivious. And on the nightstand, her phone. My son moved first, snatching it up, his breath sharp and unsteady. The screen was locked. But we had planned for this. Blair had given us the passcode. With shaking fingers, he entered it. The phone unlocked with a soft click. And then, we saw everything. Texts, conversations, transactions, names of men, times, dates. Pictures that made my vision blur with rage, my stomach twist with a sickness so violent I nearly dropped to my knees. Lisa hadn't just stolen Blair. She had sold her, traded her innocence like a commodity, and she had kept records of everything, a digital trail leading straight to the monsters who had taken part. My son's breath hitched, a broken sound of anguish and fury, and that was when Lisa stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion flickering across her face, until she saw us, until she saw the phone in his hand. Then everything shifted. She bolted upright, scrambling back against the headboard, her mouth opening to scream. But my son was faster. He lunged forward, hand clamping over her mouth, his voice a deadly whisper. "If you make a sound, I swear to God." Lisa froze. Her eyes were wide, filled with something I had never seen in them before. Not fear, not remorse, calculation. Even now, even caught, she was thinking, planning, trying to find a way out, but there was no way out. "You took my daughter," my son seethed, his hand shaking as he held up the phone. "You stole her. You sold her." His voice cracked. "You..." He cut himself off, breathing hard. "I should kill you." Lisa's lips curled into something eerily close to a smirk. "But you won't." Her voice was soft, almost mocking. "Because you need me." The arrogance in her tone made my skin crawl. Even now, she thought she had the upper hand, that she could talk her way out of this. I stepped forward, my voice like ice. "No, Lisa, we don't need you." I held up my own phone, screen still recording. "We have everything we need." For the first time, I saw real fear flicker across her face. And that was when my son let go of her, stepping back as he exhaled sharply, trembling with barely controlled rage. "You're done." His voice was hollow, devoid of anything but cold certainty. "By the time the sun rises, you'll be in a cell, and you'll never see the light of day again." Lisa lunged, but I was faster. I grabbed her wrist, twisting it back as she shrieked. "You don't get to run," I hissed. "Not this time." And just as the first flashing lights appeared outside, just as the sound of sirens pierced the night, I saw it. The moment Lisa realized it was over. The moment she knew that for all her cunning, for all her cruelty, she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated us. And now, she was going to pay. Lisa was arrested before dawn. The evidence on her phone was damning, enough to bring down not just her, but the entire ring she had been involved with. The men she had worked with, the ones who had taken Blair. Every name was handed over to the authorities, every piece of her monstrous empire dismantled. Blair was safe. Finally, truly safe. But she would carry the scars forever. And my son, he was different now. Changed. The man he had been before Blair's disappearance was gone. But in his place was something stronger. A father who had walked through hell to bring his daughter home. And a man who would never, ever let her be hurt again.